And John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, refused ever to allow a vote on it. And so immigration reform languishes. One of the lead stories in today's New York Times is that a criminal justice reform act that has wide bipartisan support, not only bipartisan support within Congress, that is supported both, say, by Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, and Richard Durbin, the Democratic whip in the Senate. It is supported by the ACLU and the Koch brothers. It really does have unusually wide base of support. The gist of the article is that it's going nowhere the rest of the session for a very simple reason. Mitch McConnell, who runs the Senate as Republican Majority Leader, refuses to bring it up to a vote because it might embarrass some Republicans running for re-election in a couple of months. And then the gist of the article is that even if there's a lame duck session, which there almost certainly will be, it's very unlikely that criminal justice reform will move to the top of the queue as something that needs to be done. So there really is no reason for optimism. Indeed, my own view is that the next 4 years are spectacularly unlikely to be any better than the past 4 years, and with regard to actual accomplishments of the national government. I don't want to take the time now to offer the full analysis. I'll be glad to do Q&A. But let me simply begin by saying that we will be in what I think is the historically anomalous, if not unprecedented position that a majority of the country will believe that the next President of the United States is illegitimate. That is to say, again, if you rely on current polling data, it is spectacularly unlikely that either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump will get a majority of the vote. Right now, the most recent polls show Clinton with about 44%, Trump with 42%, Gary Johnson with 10 to 12%, and Jill Stein with 3%. It may be that as we get closer to November 8th, more and more people will decide not to vote for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein for that matter. But one has to remember that Barack Obama was the first Democratic president in many, many years to win with a majority of the vote. Bill Clinton did not get a majority of the vote in either of his elections. Got 49.8, something like that, in 1996, running against a quite weak Republican candidate, that is Bob Dole, but he couldn't cross the finish line with a majority. And right now, if you were going to make a bet, even if, according to those who take bets on elections, you're still well advised to bet for Hillary Clinton, the odds are roughly 2-1 or 3-1, depending on what you read that she's going to win. That's very, very different from betting that she's going to get a majority of the vote. I think it'd be quite foolish to make that bet. And given the way this campaign is running, given that a steady trope for her opponent is that she ought to be locked up, it's very difficult to imagine what the concession speech would look like or will look like when Donald Trump loses. But let me say, quite frankly, it's also impossible to see what the concession speech would look like if Hillary Clinton loses, because I think it's fair to say that most of Clinton's supporters, whatever they think of her, believe that Trump is a narcissistic sociopath and do not view him with the same degree, ultimately, of grudging tolerance as, say, Mitt Romney or John McCain, or for that matter, George W. Bush in 2000. So this does not portend a happy future for American politics. The winter or the year long of our discontent is certainly bound to continue. So, with that as the background, and a not very happy background, let me turn to the kind of official topic of today's remarks, which is, what does the Constitution have to do with this? I've already suggested one possible answer. That is to move from a focus, an almost exclusive focus, on the deficiencies of leaders, or for that matter, the polarization of the American electorate, the role of money in politics, American political culture, the fact that we are a wildly pluralistic country, more pluralistic certainly than was the case in 1787, but we shouldn't overestimate the factor of difference. The fact is, we were, relative to most countries in the world, wildly pluralistic in 1787. We've simply become more so. And it has always been a challenge of how do you keep a pluralistic country that is very divided along a number of important dimensions together. And the fact is, we didn't do it. We killed 750,000 people between 1861 and 1865 to keep the Union together. And you live within, I think, about 40 miles, it might even be closer than that, of what I think remains the bloodiest single battlefield, that is Antietam. And then I think you're about an hour and a half away from Gettysburg, which is the canonical battlefield of what you may want to call the Civil War. There are people who want to call it the war between the states, the war to suppress Southern independence. When I teach it, I call it the War of 1861-65, or more properly, I've recently become convinced, the War of 1861-1871, because the Appomattox did not bring an end to the war. It simply brought an end to one part of the armed struggle, but it was succeeded very, very shortly afterward by an insurgency that we can call the Ku Klux Klan, and by the political demands of how one responds to an all too popular insurgency that opposed the kind of regime change that Reconstruction signified. Generally speaking, I don't know about your own history courses or political science courses, generally speaking, American academics don't dwell on the events of 1861, 1865, unless they happen to be teaching a course called the American Civil War. But when I took American history many, many years ago, the first semester stopped in 1861, the second semester began in 1877. Somehow or other, the 14th Amendment had magically appeared in the Constitution, but there was no discussion about the unpleasantness that actually brought about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and whether those really sufficed to overcome the kind of cleavages in the United States. So what I want to argue, and indeed have argued now over at least 2.5 books, is that we desperately need to connect the dots between our overall political system established by the Constitution and the outputs we're getting. Because when one talks about satisfaction, the direction of the country, what one is measuring is approval of the outputs of the political system. If we liked what the political system was giving us, then presumably we approve of it. And we might very well approve of it even if the political system were far less democratic than it is. My first book, in what turned out to be a duo of books, the one that William referred to, and the one that many of you are assigned, that is our democratic Constitution, focused on the fact that the United States Constitution is demonstrably the most undemocratic, not only of any of the major constitutions of the world today, that is the ones that we link with the West or other constitutional democracies, but also, and just as importantly, and this is a major theme of the second book called Framed, America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance, that we in the United States have 51 constitutions, not really 51 constitution, though many people don't realize that. And if you look at American state constitutions, you discover that each and every one of them is more democratic than the United States Constitution. Maryland, for example, along with 13 other states, has a provision that I very much wish the United States Constitution had. That is, every 20 years, the citizenry of Maryland has a constitutional right under its state constitution to vote on whether or not to have a new state constitutional convention. New York next year will be conducting what I think will be the most important of the 2017 elections, because their constitution too allows a similar vote every 20 years. There are a lot of people who think that New York is in dire need of constitutional reform, and if New York can demonstrate that it's really possible for a major state, pluralistic state, to engage in constitutional reform, then that might actually encourage people to believe that a national constitution is less crazy than most of my friends and family believe it is. But what I discovered in terms of the response to our democratic constitution is that most people really could care less whether the Constitution is democratic or undemocratic, because that's really a question of what political scientists might call inputs. That is, how exactly is the sausage made? And so the democratic critique says, well, it's made through a process that really doesn't fit very well 21st century notions of democracy. So what? Who cares? If the output of the sausage factory is tasty and nutritious, then it might really be perfectly acceptable that the inputs aren't all that democratic. And I really was persuaded by many of the respondents to the first book that even though it's demonstrably true that the United States Constitution is wildly undemocratic, maybe it doesn't matter if the outputs are all right. But the message I draw from the polling data that I put before you, there's much other data as well to talk about, is that most people these days aren't satisfied with the outputs. They don't think they're being well served by the national government. They have contempt for our leaders. But the message they draw is, well, we have to replace bad leaders, the villains, with good leaders, the heroes. And that will change things. And the argument I want to make is, no, it won't. Because whoever the leaders are, they have to work within a political system designed in 1787 and changed remarkably little thereafter. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are very, very important. I do not wish to denigrate them. However, they do almost nothing to change the basic structures of American government as created in 1787. We still live under a bicameral system. That is, there's a House and a Senate. It is still the case that, at least from my perspective, the Senate is absolutely indefensible under any 21st century notion of democratic legitimacy. That is, we talk about one person, one vote. as if we take it seriously. But if you do take it seriously, then it is absolutely indefensible that Wyoming has the same voting power in the Senate as California, with 70%, with 70 times the population. It happens to be the case, given my own politics, that I like the two senators from Vermont and do not like the two senators from my home state of Texas. That being said, I still think it's indefensible that Vermont, with about 600,000 people, can offset the 26 million people in Texas because of the Senate. Now, it would be one thing, I suppose, if the framers thought the Senate and equal vote in the House was a really wonderful idea. They didn't. If you look at Federalist number 62, in which Publius, who happens to be James Madison, is talking about equal voting power in the Senate, he describes it as a necessary evil. Why is it